You ever think about how, like, getting a tax refund used to feel like hitting the jackpot?
Yeah, like back when we were kids, you know?
Yeah, it was almost like a celebration, you know? Like,
Totally.
look at all this money I got back from the government.
It's funny how different things are now.
Right.
Now it's like, ah, gotta do my taxes.
It's a chore, a burden.
Exactly.
Well, today we're going to dive deep into the history of income tax in America
Oh, cool.
to see how it evolved, from this thing people were excited about to something most people dread.
I'm interested to see where this goes.
Me too.
Where?
We're basing this deep dive on a really fascinating interview with historian Molly Mitchellmore
Okay.
from an episode of NPR's Throughline podcast.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a great show.
It is.
So Mitchellmore talks about how in the late 19th century, people were actually pushing for an income tax.
Really?
Yeah, they saw it as a way to make the super rich pay their fair share.
The robber barons.
Exactly.
So, was that the first time America ever had an income tax?
Actually, no. The very first one was during the Civil War.
Oh, right. To fund the war effort.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I had to pay for all those guns and ammo somehow.
And it was seen as a fairer way to raise revenue compared to things like the whiskey tax.
Which mainly hit the poor and working class.
Right.
So after the war, what happened to the income tax?
They got rid of it. For a while, anyway.
But it came back.
It did. By the late 1800s, people started getting really frustrated with the way the government was raising money.
How so?
The system relied heavily on tariffs.
Tariffs on imported goods.
Right. And those tariffs were seen as benefiting the wealthy industrialists.
At the expense of everyone else.
Exactly. Farmers were struggling to sell their products overseas because tariffs made them more expensive.
And consumers were paying higher prices for everyday goods.
So you had this growing movement of people who wanted a more equitable system.
And they saw income tax as the solution.
They did. They thought it was a way to make the wealthiest Americans contribute more proportionally.
Replace those tariffs with something more fair.
Right. And this movement was really powerful. It even led to the formation of the Populist Party.
Interesting.
But there was a problem. The Supreme Court.
Oh, no. What did they do?
They ruled that a federal income tax was unconstitutional.
Really?
Yeah, in 1895. They said it violated a clause about direct taxes having to be apportioned based on state population.
So that was the end of income tax.
Not quite. The idea didn't go away. People still wanted a fair system.
Especially with another war on the horizon.
You're talking about the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, wars are expensive. The government needed money.
Plus, the idea of income tax as a tool for social justice had really taken hold.
So how did they get around the Supreme Court ruling?
They went straight to the source. They amended the Constitution.
That's a pretty bold move.
It was, and it worked. That's how we got the 16th Amendment.
The one that allows for a federal income tax.
That's right. It was ratified in 1913.
A huge turning point.
But even then, the initial income tax was pretty limited.
How so?
It only applied to the very wealthiest Americans.
So not the mass tax we have today.
Not yet. It was more of a symbolic step towards a fairer system than a major revenue generator.
So when did it become something that most Americans had to pay?
Well, World War I definitely saw a big increase in income tax rates.
To help finance the war effort?
Exactly. And there was this idea of drafting the dollars of the wealthy.
Since working class men were being drafted to fight.
Yeah. It was seen as a way for the wealthy to contribute their part.
Makes sense.
But it still wasn't quite the mass tax we know today.
Right.
That transformation happened during World War II.
Oh, of course. With the massive scale of that war.
To fund the war effort, the government had to find ways to raise a lot of money.
So income tax became something that most working Americans had to pay.
Right. It went from a class tax to a mass tax.
And how did people feel about that?
Well, the government launched this huge public relations campaign to try to get people on board.
A PR campaign for paying taxes.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Sounds strange, but it was actually pretty. They used everything from Donald Duck cartoons to catchy songs by Irving Berlin.
Donald Duck promoting taxes? That's amazing.
It was all about framing paying taxes as a patriotic duty.
As essential to winning the war.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
really played up that angle.
It's fascinating how they were able to mobilize public opinion like that.
It's a great example of how government messaging can really shape how people think, especially during times of crisis.
And it probably helped that people felt like their tax dollars were being used for something tangible.
Like supporting the troops and defeating the enemy.
Right. There was a clear connection between paying taxes and the war effort.
That sense of collective purpose must have made a big difference.
It's hard to imagine something like that happening today.
Right.
But we still have a lot more to cover.
We do. The post-war period brought a whole new set of challenges and changes to the world of income tax.
Right.
And that's where we'll pick up next time.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, we've seen income tax go from a Civil War thing to a mass tax that everyone had to pay during World War II.
It's been quite the journey.
Yeah, so what about after the war ended? Did that sense of everyone pitching in, for the greater good, did that stick around?
Well, the post-war period was interesting. You had the economic boom, the suburbs were growing, everyone was feeling pretty optimistic.
So did people actually like paying taxes then?
Well, like mull might be a strong word,
Okay.
but they definitely felt like they were getting something back for their money.
What do you mean?
Mitchell Moore mentions this crazy story in the interview about how in the early 60s, the Kennedy administration proposed a 20% tax cut for everyone.
A tax cut.
Yeah, and no one really cared.
What? They didn't want their taxes cut.
Apparently not. People felt like their tax dollars were actually working for them.
How so?
Well, they were funding all this new infrastructure. The interstate highway system was being built. Public schools were expanding.
So people could see where their money was going.
Right. They felt like they were part of something bigger contributing to this collective progress.
Wow, that's so different from how people view taxes today.
It is. But that sense of shared prosperity and faith in the government didn't last forever.
So what happened? When did things start to change?
The 1970s were a turning point.
The 70s.
Yeah, think about it. High inflation, unemployment. People started to feel uncertain about the future.
So they started questioning whether they were getting their money's worth from the government.
Exactly. That's when the whole unfair taxation thing started to take hold.
People felt like they were paying too much and not getting enough in return.
Right. And it wasn't just talk either. This is when you start seeing the rise of anti-tax movements.
Like Proposition 13 in California.
Exactly. Prop 13 was huge. It capped property taxes and really fueled the anti-tax sentiment that was brewing.
So this was a pretty significant shift in the political landscape.
Absolutely. And it's around this time that you see alternative economic theories like supply-side economics starting to gain traction.
Supply-side economics, that's a term you hear a lot, but what does it actually mean?
Basically, it's the idea that cutting taxes, especially for businesses and wealthy individuals, will lead to economic growth.
So the idea is that these tax cuts will trickle down to everyone.
Exactly. It's all about stimulating investment and creating jobs.
And this became a core part of the Republican Party's platform.
Absolutely. They really championed tax cuts as the solution to economic problems.
So we went from this period of relative agreement on taxes to this very partisan divide.
Right, and that made it much harder to find common ground on tax policy.
It's interesting how economics and politics are so intertwined.
They really are. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of the income tax story, the hidden welfare state.
The hidden welfare state, what's that?
It's this idea that the U.S. tax code is often used to achieve social policy goals.
Instead of direct government programs.
Right. So instead of providing things like health care or child care directly, the government uses tax breaks and deductions to encourage certain behaviors.
Like what?
Well, home ownership, for example, or employer-sponsored health insurance.
So it's a way of providing social benefits indirectly through the tax code.
Exactly. And the hitting part is important because these benefits are kind of buried in this complex system.
It makes it hard for people to see the direct impact of their taxes.
Right. They might not even realize they're benefiting from these tax breaks.
So they just feel like they're paying a lot and not getting anything in return.
Exactly. Which can lead to that feeling of unfairness that we were talking about.
So basically, we've got this complex system where economic theories, political agendas, and this hidden welfare state all kind of intersect.
It's definitely complicated.
No wonder people have such mixed feelings about income tax.
It's a fascinating story, though, and it's important to understand how we got here if we want to have any hope of figuring out where we go from here.
Wow, it's been quite a journey learning about how income tax in America has changed over the years.
From its early days during the Civil War to this whole complicated system we have now.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the biggest takeaways for you?
I think one of the most interesting things is how the idea of fair taxation has evolved.
Yeah, like what people considered radical back then is totally normal now.
Exactly. What was once unthinkable is now just how things are.
Like income tax going from something only the super rich paid to a tax that most working Americans pay.
Exactly. It shows you how much things can change over time.
And it seems like public perception plays a huge role in those changes.
Definitely. How people think and feel about taxes has a big impact on what actually happens with tax policy.
Like that whole PR campaign during World War II to make paying taxes seem patriotic.
It's amazing how they were able to shift people's attitudes.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if we could do something similar today to get people more engaged in the conversation about taxes.
Maybe, but it also highlights this idea that taxes are about the social contract.
What do you mean?
When people feel like they're getting something back for their money, they're more likely to be okay with paying taxes.
It's like they're investing in something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. But when that connection breaks down, when people feel like they're paying too much and not getting enough in return, that's when problems arise.
Like that feeling of unfairness we were talking about earlier.
Right. And it all circles back to that hidden welfare state idea. The more complicated and opaque the system is, the harder it is for people to see the connection between what they're paying and what they're getting.
And that lack of transparency can really erode trust in the system.
Absolutely. So I think moving forward, it's crucial to make the tax system more understandable and accessible,
So people can actually see how their tax dollars are being used.
and feel confident that the system is fair and equitable.
Because ultimately, taxes are about how we as a society decide to fund the things we value.
Right, it's about investing in our collective future.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about,
Me too.
and I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
It's such an important topic and one that we should all be more informed about.
Absolutely. So if you've been enjoying this deep dive, make sure to subscribe to our show for more thought-provoking conversations like this one.
And don't forget to leave us a review. Let us know what you think.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those brains working.